All right, so just testing this out, hearing how the mic sounds and how good the video quality is. I would like to review this book, Lives of the Poets by Michael Schmidt. I just finished this book, actually just a few weeks ago. One of the things I enjoyed so much about it is that it's not merely an overview of poetry. It's not like the author just captures a bunch of movements within poetry and then decides to dissect those movements and give some quotes here and there. No, what's far more interesting is that it actually fits the title. It gives the lives of the poets. It talks about their struggles, their passions, and it gives the critical view of them of their time. So in the time that each of these poets were living, they obviously were being judged by many of their contemporaries. They're being judged by the public. And the author dives into that throughout each of the descriptions of the poets' lives. The other thing that's really different and interesting about this book is how it's organized. So the first half is organized mostly chronologically, right? It follows each of the poets through the time that they were alive, through the time that they were publishing. And you get a sense of sort of the movements of poetry over time. So the ways in which poetry evolves by influence from prior poets. Now, of course, this isn't direct influence. It's not like every single poet was directly inspired by all the prior ones. However, there are long threads of influence that take place throughout the book, and I feel like the author really captures that nicely. Now that is for the first half, where it's chronological. The second half follows far more of the branches or literary movements that were occurring. So he sort of has initially chronological, and then suddenly it's branched off, and you can kind of get sections of time, right? So this is for mostly the poets, the modern, postmodern, maybe contemporary poets that start to exist. Now, he doesn't break down these literary movements in a way that's like a textbook where you can clearly follow, okay, so these are the postmodernists, this is what their idea was, here are the beatniks, right? He doesn't do quite that. What he does instead is he just segments the chapters by the figures within those movements and then lets you figure out, well, what are their thoughts, right? Who are the futurists? Who are the surrealists? What are their thinking? And he sort of mixes that in with their biography. Now, throughout much of the book, the chapters are thematic mostly. So the chapter titles themselves do not make the theme abundantly clear. It sort of evolves through reading it where you figure out, okay, so this is what's actually being discussed. So here's what I mean. Let me give you an example. We have our sublime superiors. That's one of the names of the chapters. Now, what does that mean? Our sublime superiors. Well, in this case, he's referring to all publishers. And so that's the second chapter in the book. It's just him talking about the various publishers within the history of literature and how often these publishers are missed or ignored. We sort of forget about them. And he has a whole chapter on that. He has the chapter, The Other War. Okay, you might be able to figure that out, right? Based on the chapter title, that's referring to World War II. So he has many World War II poetry writers that he discusses. He has Language and the Body. Who might that be? That's probably, in this case, the Beatniks, right? So we get Allen Ginsberg and people along those lines, right? So these chapter titles give hints of what the theme of each chapter is. And then you as a reader get to slowly kind of understand, okay, this is the impulse of this chapter. This is where it's going, right? This is what the chapter is trying to make me understand and realize. Now, one thing that's somewhat confusing about that is because the chapter titles are so poetic, some might say unclear, it can be hard to quite know what the point of the chapter is until you've read quite a bit into it. One of the ways in which this gets even more confusing is that each chapter is focused on multiple poets at once, right? Seemingly the poets who fit within that theme that the author is trying to outline. But there's no hard breaks between each poet. So what I mean by this is you will be reading, for example, in the Beat chapter about Allen Ginsberg, and you'll be reading about his life. You'll be reading about his poetry. You'll see some quotes here and there. The poem Hal obviously gets brought up because it's such a significant piece for him. And then it will immediately transition into another poet. Like literally the paragraph will be talking about Allen Ginsberg and it seems like it's building up to the end of his life or something. And then suddenly we're talking about another poet. And there's no line there. There's no break. It's just another paragraph. He does this throughout the book. Now this comes with both good and bad, in my opinion. Because there's no hard breaks between each poet, it makes the poets themselves feel as if they flow into each other via influence, as if their thematic connection is more than just an arbitrary connection placed on top of them, but rather something that lives with them. And the poet captures that, I shouldn't say poet, the author of the book captures that nicely. However, this also leads to some problems in relation to the contents page. So the contents page lists each of the chapters, and then it gives each of the poets. But sometimes the order that the poets appear in the chapter does not match their appearance in the book. And so you can't really rely on the contents page to help you know who am I going to be reading about here and when are they going to show up. So I ended up marking the contents page quite substantially. So if you look at my, not sure how well you can see it, I sort of marked it up all over the place. Sort of my way to try to organize it. I basically, each time a break happened, I noted, okay, so this is this poet, this is a summation of what this poet's about. And I try to keep track of it. And in so doing, I noticed that a lot of times the order that they show up does not actually match when they appear in the actual book. Another thing that's unusual in relation to the contents page is that some poets are mentioned far more than other poets, and yet they're not even on the contents page. There are some poets who I will read about in the book, and it would grab my attention. I say, okay, that's interesting. And I go to the contents page to see their name there, and they're not even listed. And so I have to add their name in and put a little asterisk or something. The other thing is there's some poets whose names are in the contents page, and then they don't actually appear in the text, or at least I don't seem to notice them, because potentially they just appear really quickly. Like they're sort of mentioned as just a friend of a poet, and yet they're put on the contents page, but they're not given much biography beyond that. There's an inconsistency in the book. And there's no perfect spot or way to mark these separations. It's sort of so fluid that you, as a reader, just have to pay attention to what is being discussed, who is being discussed, and what kind of work is being discussed. Now, for me, like I said before, this is both a blessing and a curse. It feels a bit like I am flowing through time with these poets. I'm getting to understand them as if I'm living in their world, and they're all kind of mixing together because that's how life is. Life itself doesn't have clear demarcations, and so it kind of mimics that feeling as if I'm there in time with all of these people. But as a work of reference, as something to look to the contents and then jump around and see, like, okay, I wanted a specific biography about, Wallace Stevens or someone of that ilk. And then I go expecting to find the page number for that. No, I have to rely on the index. And sometimes the index itself isn't fully reliable. So it's a little inconsistent, but I don't want to use that to knock the book negatively too much, because the feel of the flow of the writing is something that is special. And it's one of the reasons why I want to make a video on this. Speaking of the flow, one of the things that the author does really nicely is there's an abundance of quotes throughout the book. So he's constantly quoting pieces of poems by these poets in order to illustrate their poetic writing style. And in fact, even though he does this quite a lot, I would have liked him to do it even more, because I felt so engaged with his summation of what these poets were discussing. When he talks about their life, he will have a piece of a poem that would reflect directly what it is that they were going through in their life. And it was so wonderful to have that sort of weaved in throughout the book. And I really would have liked even more of that. I actually became especially engaged with the language of the poetry, even though this book is not like a Norton anthology, right? It's not like just a collection of poetry. It's supposed to be about their lives. But I actually found myself most engaged by the poetry in the process of reading this book. So if you are someone who is interested in poetry, but didn't have direct experience with a lot of it, right? I was an English major, but I didn't specialize in poetry. So it's really nice to get a book like this that gives their lives, but mixes in a lot of their poetry. Now, in some cases, this would drag it down a little bit. So, for example, I mentioned that the book begins chronologically and then it goes through and eventually branches into different fields. But in the early portion of the book, when he quotes the poems, a lot of them are archaic. They contain archaic spelling, right? So they're not quite easy to read. A lot of them, it matches the Middle English or the early modern English of the time. And you have to really kind of struggle to read those. And he eventually stops with the archaic spelling earlier than you might expect. He's sort of like, it's almost as if at some point around 200 pages in, he realizes, this maybe actually makes the flow harder to get into, especially if you're an introductory reader of poetry, or you're a reader who's just been introduced to poetry. It may be best to maybe modernize the spelling a little bit, and he ends up doing that. But for the first 200 pages or so, it is difficult to get through the archaic spelling of some of the early modern and or Middle English that exists. The other thing that's really nice about the book is he spent so much time with giving the impression that the poets had left on readers. He really discusses in great detail the critical reception around poets, the ways in which the poets were feeding off of the reception that they were receiving. And in some cases, many poets were feeling quite depressed about the reception that they're receiving. Now, one of the things that should be noted, and I think I've mentioned this at least a little bit, is the flow of this book is highly distinct. And one of the main reasons that that flow is so distinct is that the style of writing itself is poetic. It's not merely a description of lives like an encyclopedia. What it tends to do is it will describe in such a way where there is beauty in the description of what the poet is going through. There's ways in which the author of this book seems himself to be almost a poet describing poetry. It really makes it feel almost oddly like a novel of poetic history. Now, with this comes a variety of lofty claims throughout the book. So, for example, he'll say things like, "With the ballad, journalism is born." I mean, it's not a statement of fact. It's a statement of opinion formulated as a statement of fact. And those are the sorts of claims that he throws out throughout the book. So you have to go in knowing that that's going to occur. Now, I do appreciate a great deal the human introduction to these people that this book offers. It's not merely an introduction to the work. It's an introduction to the humans behind these works. And the book is so hefty itself that it maybe introduction is a misnomer, right? It may not be good as an introduction, but it's certainly good as a way to connect with authors throughout history, poetic writers, and to try and understand where they're coming from and why they wrote the way that they did. This book may be easier read, not in one go, like I read it. I just sort of stuck with it for a month, and it's quite long. It may be better to grab it from time to time, read a little bit of a chapter or maybe a whole chapter at a time, and just have that thematic link between the writers and just flow in between the writers in the way that this book does nicely, and just have that be your way to go through it. Mostly because the language itself is so consistently poetic. It is as much about the content, or is less about the content and more about the language, right? And so that lends it toward sort of picking it up in little bursts and then just taking in the beauty over the strict factual record that most other books would have. In that sense, this book does not follow the rules of most nonfiction. It's not organized for the sake of convenience, but rather it's organized for a flowing overview, right? The author's voice, the author of this book, is consistent throughout this. It's emphasized. His intention is thrown in. There's no faux objectivity. There's no faux objectivity being done by this author, right? He's really pushing himself, his subjectivity, into the work. One major effect of reading this book that you should keep in mind is it will add a great deal to your wish list of books that you will want in the future. I know it did for me. I bought John Keats. I bought William Butler Yeats. I bought Wallace Stevens. I bought William Wordsworth. I bought Allen Ginsberg. Whole collections, many, many, many different writers. In spite of, even in some cases, the author of this book would be quite critical of these writers. He doesn't seem to be a big fan of Allen Ginsberg, but the excerpts of Allen Ginsberg that were given really grabbed my attention and made me want to read more. Right? He gives enough excerpts that even if the author's opinion is quite negative, he gives you enough of a sense of these writers so that you can decide for yourself how deeply you want to dive into this. And in many ways, this book has helped push me to continue to want to read and learn about poetry. I think that's perhaps one of the best things about it. And again, this isn't equivalent to an anthology. I'll probably get a Norton anthology and read through that. But it is a connection to writers. It's a connection to the writerly voice itself, because the author really puts himself into this book in terms of his style. And it's a connection to feeling that poetry is important to write about, important to think about. and I value that a great deal. And I really, really enjoyed reading this book, and I'm looking forward to the next book by this author. I have it here. He has this book called The Novel, a biography, and so he does the same kind of thing, right, where he goes through the lives of various writers. In this case, it seems like he's going to actually emphasize even more on the work and perhaps less on the lives, and I'm kind of interested in how that's going to turn out. But he writes so beautifully, he writes so poetically, that I'm curious to see how this is going to feel to go through that. It's not a traditional historical overview. It feels far more creative than most. So I just want to bring this book up because I just finished reading it. I really liked it a lot. I want to share my interest in it to others, and hopefully you'll find this review interesting. I read a lot of books, so I will probably continue making some of these videos, making reviews or my impressions of books, or maybe I'll just show the insides of books, because I know when I'm shopping, I sometimes just want to look at, like, well, what's in the book? Like, show me the pages, show me how it feels, how thin are the pages, right? How many images are there in this book? You know, how organized is the book? Is the text really small? I want to see those kinds of things, so maybe I'll do those kinds of videos as well. But if you're interested in seeing more of what I have to say about various books, please subscribe. If you want to share this with anyone, please like. And yeah, we'll see. And maybe I'll improve the quality over time. But right now I'm just relaxing, making some videos. And yeah, I'll see you next time.